Yeah, so the title of my talk is Pro Tem Rationality. If you've never heard of that before, that's good because I made it up. So if you had heard of it before, then I would have a problem. So, you know, like Sinan told us on the first day that if you want people to talk about your views, you should give them names. So this is my attempt to accomplish that. And the thesis I want to argue for in this talk is that there is a large class of rationality judgments that we routinely endorse, but that fall neither into the category of doxastic rationality or justification, nor the category of propositional rationality or justification. And so what I want to propose is that we should account for these judgments by introducing a new notion of rationality, and I will call this pro tem rationality. But I first want to talk a little bit about doxastic and propositional rationality and how that distinction has entered discussions in formal and Bayesian epistemology. So Bayesian theories of rationality commonly endorse a variety of norms on rational credences. For example, the norm that your credences should be probabilistically representable. And if we go with that norm, certain things follow from that. For example, all tautologies have to be assigned a credence of 1, or if P entails Q, your credence in Q should be at least as high as your credence in P. Okay. Now, some people think that those are implausible requirements of rationality, and sometimes they say things like this. For example, they say, look, suppose a normal human thinker is very confident in a set of axioms, for example, the axioms of arithmetic. That doesn't mean they're irrational if they're not equally or more confident in every truth that can be derived from them, right? So even if I could do the math to demonstrate that the 6th digit of pi is a 2, right, I shouldn't be confident in that, rationally speaking, unless I've actually done the math or looked it up or something like that. Or, you know, take the requirement that all tautologies should get credence 1. Here the worry would be, well, look, if you show me a formula and I haven't really figured out yet that it's a tautology, right? If I haven't thought about it, surely then I shouldn't assign credence 1. So it seems better to have some kind of more moderate credence until I've actually done like a truth table or a proof, or I've, you know, on paper in my head or whatever. And Bayesians have responded to these sorts of challenges by clarifying what kinds of rationality judgments or norms they think their theory proposes. They say, look, probabilism is a requirement of propositional rationality, not doxastic rationality. So just to, you know, say something about that distinction, we already saw that in Anasara's talk the other day. So in traditional epistemology, the general way of making this distinction goes roughly like this. A claim P is propositionally justified for an agent, just in case the agent has reasons or evidence that supports it. And if somebody has propositional justification for a claim, and then they also say believe it based on those reasons or based on that evidence, then their belief in P would be doxastically justified. And because of this relationship, doxastic justification entails propositional justification. So you can't be doxastically justified unless you're also propositionally justified. And now what Bayesians say is like, look, these requirements of ideal rationality, such as probabilism, they are requirements of propositional rationality because they are requirements that spell out what the agent's evidence demands. And so the idea is something like, well, for logical truths, right, you sort of have all the evidence you need because that's something you can figure out a priori. And so that's what's propositionally rational. But of course, right, if you assign a tautology a credence 1 just by sort of guessing that it's a tautology, then that doesn't give you doxastic justification. And so then they say, well, these putative counterexamples, what they do is they track intuitions about what's doxastically rational, but they don't track intuitions about what's propositionally rational, and so we don't have a problem. Okay. Now, I think so far so good. I can get on board with that. But I think once we look a little bit more closely at more detailed cases, we're going to see that there are these rationality judgments that we make all the time that we can't capture with this little story that I just told you. So I want to give you 3 cases now. 2 are about logical or mathematical reasoning. 1 is about reasoning from empirical evidence. And let's just look at them, and then I tell you what the significant commonalities are between them. So first, logic student. Una is a beginning logic student. She has a list of formulas, and she's asked to determine whether each formula is a tautology or not. She reads the first formula, which happens to be a tautology. And at that moment, her credence that it's a tautology is 50%. Then she writes out a truth table, and she becomes 90% confident that the formula is a tautology. And to check, she also does a little natural deduction style proof, and that works out. And as a result, she becomes virtually certain that the formula is a tautology. A second little story, digits of pi. Peter knows how to calculate digits of pi, but he hasn't memorized any of them, and he wonders whether the 6th digit of pi might be a 2. At the start, he's 10% confident that it is, and then he starts calculating in his head, and he becomes 80% confident that it's a 2. But then he thinks, oh, I just did that in my head, I better do that properly with a piece of paper. So he repeats the calculations on paper, and he gets the same answer. And so he becomes virtually certain that the 6th digit of pi is a 2. Last case is a case where somebody has empirical evidence. So Manny has committed a murder and tries to frame Fred for it. And Detective Fletcher, when she initially inspects the evidence, responds in the way that Manny has planned. So she becomes 90% confident that Fred committed the murder. But, that's just her first take. And so she knows she needs to think about this more. And so she thinks about the evidence a little bit more. And as she does that, she discovers some incongruencies that ultimately lead her to see that Fred was framed. And so she reduces her confidence that Fred is the murderer to 5%. Anybody recognize Detective Fletcher? Where is she from? Anyone? No? Murder, She Wrote? Serious gap. So here are the important commonalities between the cases. So in each case, we have an agent who, in a sense, has fixed evidence, right? So they're not learning any new information. They have a certain amount of information, and that's what they reason with. And they reason about something that's complicated, and they ultimately arrive at the credence that's rational given their evidence. But also, each agent progresses through some other credences that are different from the ones that they get to at the end. And it's not important to me that you agree exactly that the cases should go like that. You can sort of tinker with them if you want. What I need is that you give me the following 2 assumptions. First, it's important for me to say that the credences that are rational before the inquiry is completed are different from the ones that are rational at the end, right? So for example, I need it to be true that, initially before you've done the proof, you should be, say, maybe 50% confident or maybe 33% confident that the formula is a tautology, whereas at the end, right, after you've done the reasoning, you should have credence 1. Also, it's important for these, for what I want to do with these cases, that you think if the agent had substantially different credences during various stages of their reasoning, those credences would have been less rational or irrational. So for example, right, take the digits of pi case. So when I ask my students this question, what's your confidence that the 6th digit of pi is a 2? Some of them say 10%. What do the other ones say? 50%, right? They say 50% because they think, oh, well, it's a 2 or it's not a 2, so 50%, right? And then they're like, oh, wait, right? So it seems like 10% is a better answer than 50%. Similarly, right, with Detective Fletcher, Manny did not a terrible job at framing Fred, right? And so it seems like before she's actually realized that there's something kind of wrong with the evidence, it seems like she should be initially impressed by it and think that Fred is implicated by it, right? It should be only upon realizing sort of, why it doesn't all fit together that she should drop her confidence that it was Fred, right? So it seems like there's sort of like rational credences to be had there. Now, here's something you might wonder about with these cases. Maybe you might say, well, look, why are these agents forming any credences at all before they're done reasoning? Why shouldn't they just, suspend judgment and not assign maybe any credence or any attitude at all. And so, finish their reasoning, and then once they sort of think they've figured out an answer, then they kind of make up their mind. I don't think that's a good description of how this goes in real life. And also I think it also wouldn't be advisable from a normative point of view, because right, so you're not always in the luxurious position where you can finish your deliberations, right? So sometimes you get interrupted, you don't really have enough time to kind of really think through something to your satisfaction. And so you need to kind of know sort of what your reasoning has sort of delivered so far, if you need to kind of, take an action before you're able to kind of really think through your evidence. And also, it seems like it's important to keep track of these transitional judgments, because you might want to sort of do certain actions on their basis. So for example, right, in the Fletcher case, you might think, if her evidence initially suggests that Fred committed the murder, well, she hasn't thought it through yet, so she wouldn't have Fred arrested for it. But what she might do is say, I'm going to make sure Fred doesn't have, an opportunity to destroy evidence or to sort of tamper with the murder scene or something, because that might be safe, right? Which maybe she wouldn't want to do if Fred initially seemed like completely innocent, right? So it seems like it's important to have these kind of transitional credences, and not to just sort of like think basically nothing at all until you've completely finished your thinking or your deliberation. Okay. Moving on to section 3 now. So what I want to convince you of now is that these rationality judgments about these initial and transitional attitudes can't be captured by our usual notions of doxastic and propositional rationality or justification. So here's how I'm setting it up. I'm saying all the initial and transitional attitudes in the examples are rationally held. 2, if a person rationally holds a belief or credence towards some claim P, then their attitude is either propositionally or doxastically rational. 3, if a person holds a doxastically rational attitude towards some claim P, then it's also propositionally rational for them to hold this attitude, right? That's just the standard entailment. And then 4, in the examples above, the propositionally rational attitudes are having a credence of 1 in the tautology in the first case, having a credence of 1 that the 6th digit of pi is a 2 in the second case, and having a credence of 5% that Fred is the murderer in the last case. So none of the initial or transitional attitudes in the examples can be propositionally rational in that sense, right? Because they differ from the ones that I just listed in 4. So now if we combine those claims, we can generate a contradiction, right? Because if none of the initial and transitional attitudes are propositionally rational, they can't be doxastically rational either. But if the only way in which you can have a rational attitude is by that attitude being either propositionally or doxastically rational, then it must be false that all the initial or transitional attitudes in the examples are rationally held, and we have to reject one of the 4 claims. Now, Bayesians obviously want to hold on to 4, right? That's a really central component of their view. But notice that I only sort of started with the Bayesian picture because I think it's sort of like a nice way to kind of bring out the problem. But, lots of other theories of justification will, underwrite the verdicts that I listed in 4, right? Those are not weird cases where like things are too hard or too idealized or too whatever, right? They're all cases where people can like, with some effort, figure out the answer. So basically you don't have to be a Bayesian to want to hold on to 4, right? Probably most people want to hold on to 4, regardless of what their theory of justification is that they favor. Now, obviously, I would also like to hold on to 1, right? Because I think those are kind of important rationality judgments that we make that seem, good. And so I wouldn't want to just say, oh no, we have to have some kind of error theory for why we thought those attitudes were rational. So that gives us a choice of either rejecting 2 or 3. If you were to reject 3, basically the way you would do it is you would sort of like vastly expand what can fall under propositional and doxastic rationality. You can do that. I think ultimately there might not hang much on like how exactly you accommodate these judgments, but I think a good way of doing it is to just introduce a new category of rationality judgments. And so that would be rejecting two, right? To say like, no, there's not just sort of these two categories of rationality judgments that apply to these attitudes, but that we, should come up with a new category. The only person who really has said anything at all about this, as far as I can tell, is Sinan, so I'm glad that he's here. So he has a paper from 2018 where he talks about doxastic and propositional rationality for credences, and he argues that credences are, this is the part where you get to interrupt me if I attribute views to you that you don't hold, by the way. So he argues that credences are doxastically rational when they're generated by correct reasoning. But he says a few brief things about how to classify these kinds of transitional credences that I'm interested in. And so he has a few examples. So for example, the digits of pi example also comes up in his paper. And he says something along these lines. Initial non-probabilistic judgments like the ones in our cases are defeasibly doxastically rational. This rationality is defeated once we become interested or ought to be interested in the relevant propositions. Once our attention is drawn to them, we must apply suitable reasoning strategies to assign the correct credence in order to be doxastically rational. So, I think that this is sort of in the right spirit, but I think it can't quite work. And here's why. So one thing I think we want to say is that the initial credences in our examples are rational. But I'm not sure that his account allows this, because I think in each of these cases that I've given you, at the start, the person is already interested in, figuring out the answers. So it seems like on Sinan's account, the status of being defeasibly rational has already sort of been defeated because the person has sort of started becoming interested in sort of settling this question of, whether it's the sixth digit of pi is a 2. Also, the second problem is that Sinan says that any initial credence can be defeasibly rational until the agent becomes interested in the issue. But I think that's too permissive. And I think the digits of pi case actually shows us why. Because I think that when you think about, the initial attitudes in the digits of pi case, it seems way better to start out with a 10% credence that it's a 2 via some sort of like indifference reasoning over the options than to start with a 50% credence that it's a 2. And so if we just say that any initial credences, as long as you revise them later, can be defeasibly rational, we can't capture this difference that it seems like there is in each one of our cases. Similarly, right, if like in the tautology case, right, Una started with a 1% credence that the formula is a tautology, would be like, well, why would you be so unconfident that it's a tautology, right? I mean, like that doesn't make any sense. So it looks like we want to make these distinctions. We just don't want to just call anything that you start with defeasibly rational. And I think the last problem is that we saw that we were dealing not just with these initial credences, right, but also with these transitional credences that the agent had sort of through their reasoning. And again, the rationality of those would not be covered by Sinan's proposal because, again, the agent is actively investigating the matter, and so the initial sort of defeasible rationality would have been defeated already. So I think we need something a little bit more sort of like heavy duty then, and this is where the notion of pro tem rationality comes in that I want to propose to you. And I'm going to give you a definition that you're going to see and you're going to think, whoa, this is super sketchy. And yes, it is. And there's a reason why it is, because I think that similarly to the distinction between propositional and doxastic rationality, there's like sort of like a concept there that we can specify, but then fill in different ways, right? So I think that how you're going to want to ultimately spell out this notion of pro tem rationality is going to depend on whether you're maybe a Bayesian or maybe have another notion of rationality or justification. So I want to sort of give you the hull of the notion, and then it could be spelled out in different ways depending on sort of what other epistemological commitments you might have. So here's how it goes. I'm saying a doxastic attitude D is pro tem rational just in case. First, D is formed as part of a process of reasoning that is a permissible way of settling the matter at hand. And two, at the time when D is held, D is suitably attuned to the evidence the agent has considered at that stage of the deliberation and the manner in which it has been considered. So, okay, let me tell you something about why I put these conditions. I think the first condition is important because it ensures that the attitudes that the agent forms in their inquiry are part of an appropriate way of thinking about the matter at hand, right? So what I want to rule out are cases like the following, where, say, Detective Fletcher, again, is thinking about who committed the murder, but somehow, even though she has all this information about, who was at the crime scene and all this stuff, all she wants to think about are her tea leaves, right? Like, she looked at her tea leaves in the morning, and that's how she's going to try to figure out, whether Fred did it or not. And now I think it seems pretty clear that, whatever credence that Fred did it, she arrives at based on her tea leaves. We don't want to call that rational because it's just not, formed in the process of an appropriate way of thinking about who committed the murder, right? So there's no way that would ever get her sort of to a good supported attitude at the end. So we want to make sure that, the reasoning is sort of progressing in a permissible way. Of course, there's much more to say about what a permissible way of settling a matter is. I want to be pretty permissive about that because I think that in a lot of complex investigations, we often go a little bit in circles. We take the scenic route to the evidence, so I don't want to say anything too restrictive there, but I want to rule out sort of tea leaf reasoning. And then regarding the second condition, here's something that I think is important to notice about the second condition. You might be tempted to try to, say something along the following lines to try to show me that I don't need this new notion of rationality. You might say something like, well, why don't we just say that, your attitude at a certain stage of reasoning is rational just in case it's, doxastically and propositionally rational given the evidence that you've looked at so far, right? So you might think, oh, you have 10 pieces of evidence, but you've only looked at 5. So if it's rational given those 5, then, you're rational or something like that. I don't think that works because I think that in a lot of these cases, there's a sense in which in early stages of reasoning, the person has already looked at all the evidence, right? So there is a sense in which Detective Fletcher, has already kind of investigated or has already considered all the evidence that is available to her when she initially suspects Fred. It's just that upon reasoning about it more, she discovers some of these incongruencies, right? Or for example, you might think in the digits of pi case, right? When Peter does the quick mental math in his head, in a sense, all the sort of relevant, information that he needed to take into account has already been taken into account. But, he's not considering that, a satisfying way of settling the matter because he just did quick mental math in his head, and he's not going to be satisfied that really he found the solution until he double checks it on paper. So what's really important here that the rationality of the attitude doesn't just depend on how much evidence has been looked at, but it also depends very much on how it's been looked at or how thoroughly it's been sort of thought through. And that's why this simple proposal, I think, is not going to do it. Okay, now, and again, right, I say, your credence has to be suitably attuned to your evidence and the manner in which it has been considered. I mean, it doesn't get really more fudgy than that, right? So, but you know, again, I think that that's where there's room kind of to spell this out, depending on, you know, what you want to say about, you know, justification and evidential support. I think that's like the place where, you know, the work has to be put in to figure out how we exactly want to specify that. Okay, now one thing, of course, that I was thinking about when I sort of stumbled upon this was, well, there has been a lot written about notions of rationality, right? And so I was trying to go through to see if this has been somehow covered already by other notions of rationality. But so far, I've convinced myself that it really doesn't overlap with the notions that at least I'm familiar with from the literature, right? So obviously, it doesn't overlap with propositional doxastic, right? That's a different distinction. Practical theoretical rationality, right? That's different. And I mean, I've stated this all in terms of theoretical reasoning, but of course you can do the same thing for practical reasoning, right? Where like you're trying to make a decision and then you have sort of like intermediate attitudes while you're thinking through something complicated about what the correct decision is. Structural and substantive rationality, right? That's about coherence requirements versus evidential requirements. I don't think that would cover it. You might think that the discussions of ecological or bounded or non-ideal rationality somehow could somehow cover this, because in a sense, right, it's sort of like an issue of non-ideal agents, that it takes them some time to figure things out and that sometimes they don't go there on the straightest path. But I don't think that that's going to do it. I actually think that the notion of pro tem rationality could be combined with the notion, for example, of bounded rationality, because suppose you're a bounded rationality person, right? Then you'll think, well, you know, how a person should reason is not determined by these really ideal norms. It's you know, determined by their cognitive capacities and what environment they're in, and you know, blah blah blah. Well, now if you have that story, right, we can still say, oh, okay, so if you're saying about this agent that they should use this particular heuristic or strategy in this environment to solve this problem, there could still be these intermediate attitudes that they're forming, and we can ask, oh, are these intermediate attitudes rational, right? So I think the notion of pro tem rationality can be combined with the notion of bounded rationality if you want, but it's not about the same thing. Another thing I was wondering about was, why has nobody noticed before that we really need this notion of rationality, right? So I came up with sort of two reasons. First, I think a lot of the literature on reasoning is sort of always starting out by saying, let's think about the simple cases and let's think about how they work, which is fine, right? Because why would you start thinking about the complicated cases when you don't even know yet how the simple ones work? But I think that in those simple cases, right, there's no need for sort of like interesting transitional attitudes, right? You sort of go from, I haven't figured it out, to, oh, now I've done modus ponens and I have the answer, or something like that, right? So like there's not really that much going on where this notion could sort of really take hold. The other thing is that, you know, a lot of the literature on reasoning is about reasoning with, you know, outright beliefs and suspensions. And so if you just describe a reasoning process with belief, disbelief, and suspension, you're probably, even in complicated cases, just going to say that, oh, the person is suspending until, you know, they reach the conclusion. And so I think the interesting difference between the transitional attitudes that people might have as they are deliberating, I think that only really comes into view when you think about it in terms of credences. All right, so now what I want to do last is I want to tell you some applications of this notion. So first, we can apply it to cases of logical and mathematical learning, right? And this is kind of what our first two cases were about, where we can just say, the notion of pro tem rationality can explain the rationality of these like intermediate attitudes towards like logical and mathematical claims that we have as we're going through working out some kind of a priori reasoning problem. And I think that, you know, neither accounts of ideal rationality nor accounts of non-ideal rationality sort of deal with that very well yet. There are some attempts in Bayesian epistemology to kind of deal with some of this in the context of the problem of old evidence, but I don't think the sort of full generality of this issue is appreciated in those debates. Then cases of complex empirical evidence, as evidenced by the Detective Fletcher case, right? So if somebody has gathered a bunch of evidence and needs to, have some time to sort through what that evidence supports, then we can use the notion of pro tem rationality to evaluate their attitudes. And you might think from how I've presented the cases that I'm talking just about, sort of very conscious or system 2 or very sort of deliberative reasoning, but I don't think that has to be the case. I think that, sort of the more automatic reasoning processes that we go through also produce these transitional attitudes that we could evaluate if we wanted to. So I don't mean anything I'm saying to suggest that this has to be about conscious reasoning. I think the notion might also be useful in analyzing cases of peer disagreement and higher order evidence. And the reason why I sort of thought about this was because there's a paper by Han van Witmarschen from 2013 where he sort of like gives an analysis of these cases, which I think doesn't quite work, but would work if we imported the notion of pro tem rationality. So, right, so the standard example, right? So, say Lewis and I go to lunch, right? And so we say, oh, we're going to tip 20% and we're going to split the bill, but we come out with different answers, what we each owe. And it seems like, if we are equally good at math and we have the same evidence, right? We now have a problem. And so if you're steadfaster in this debate, you say, well, if Lewis in fact did the math right, then he has all the justification he needs and he should stick to his answer. But if you're a conciliationist, you're like, no, neither of you knows that they're the one who did it right, if any, right? And so then, you should like lower your confidence. And so what Van Witmarschen observed in his paper, he says, look, the steadfast view is really most plausible if you're thinking about propositional justification or propositional rationality, right? Because, the fact that I did the math wrong doesn't do anything to the fact that the actual facts of arithmetic supports Lewis's answer, right? So I can do it wrong all day if I want to. If he got the right answer, that's the answer that's supported by the evidence, right? But he says, if you're thinking about justification or rationality in doxastic terms, right, then it seems much more plausible why somebody would go for the conciliatory answer, because you might think that in order to be doxastically justified, I can't have this kind of defeater where there's reason to think that, my basing didn't work or my reasoning was faulty. And what I want to say is like, look, Van Witmarschen might be onto something here, right? But I think that he can't say that the conciliationist view fits with judgments about doxastic rationality, because it can't be that, lowering my confidence that, my answer is right is going to be doxastically rational or justified, because that would have to entail propositional justification, right? And what's propositionally justified is just whatever the right answer is given the math. And so I think what we could say, if we wanted to go with sort of a Van Witmarschen style strategies, we could say you're lowering your confidence when you learn about the disagreement could be pro tem rational, because it could be rational as sort of like a transitional attitude on the way to kind of rechecking the math and sort of figuring out who actually got it right. But that attitude couldn't be sort of like a doxastically rational sort of terminal attitude in the classical sense. Okay. Again, I don't want to say that this is how you have to think about these cases, right? But I think if this is a view of what happens in those cases that's attractive to you, I think you could, use my notion there very, very nicely. Last, I think that the notion applies very well to philosophy because, as you may have noticed, deliberating about philosophy can be very difficult and very time-consuming, and if you're anything like me, you sort of shift your confidence around a lot when you're thinking about something new, where you think, oh yeah, this sounds really good. Oh wait, no. Oh no, that's not going to work. Oh wait, no, I think it does. Oh wait, what? Right. So something like that. And I think that, even if you're a very seasoned and very careful philosopher, I'm not sure that you ever get to actual doxastically rational, views about your philosophical themes, right? So they would be credences that reflect all the evidence that you should have taken into account, and you need to have taken into account just in the right way, so everything is based properly, right? And I don't know if we ever get to that, but I think that what we can say is that, your credences are pro tem rational, right? So if you think that, philosophy is this work in progress, as I think we all should think, then I think we should be very happy to think that the attitudes we form towards our views in that process are pro tem rational. That's it.